Right, in this video, we are going to look at creating a RESTful API in SAP Gateway using OData. And this video is obviously part of a bigger series where we are going to look at creating various data sources like SAP Gateway and CDS views and a few external sources as well. And we're going to take those data sources and consume them in our front-end UI5 application. And what we're going to do is we are going to, the end product is going to look like this. And so you're going to have your own model that you can work with and that you can query data from. We're going to create two entity types and two entity sets, one from the SCAR table, one from the SFlight table. And we're actually going to link them together as well so that you can use the SCAR table to pull data from the SFlight table, which will obviously make sense as we go along. So we are going to run through the ABAP code that you're going to need to write in the back end, where to put that ABAP code. We're going to deal with any errors that you might, or sort of standard errors and debugging. We're going to look at how you call entity sets and bringing a sort of table set of data back. We're also going to look at calling a single line or calling an entity itself and passing in parameters to get back a single line of data. And more importantly, we're going to look at how to test your OData service and what to look for when you're testing, and to make sure you're getting the right data and that your setup is correct and all that sort of thing. So yeah, if you are looking to use the SAP Gateway as a data source for your front-end UI5 applications, then this is the right video for you. So with that being said, let's jump right in. Right, so let's jump straight into the SEGW transaction. So that's just SAP's gateway transaction. So like you would put in, I don't know, SE18, for example. We are now going to put in SEGW, and that takes us to the gateway service builder. So what we're going to do is we're going to effectively create a project like this, and we're going to run through all the steps to do that. But I just wanted to take you through what you would find there, and so you sort of know what to look for. So you obviously have a project up here. I've already created one called ZSFlight Test, but we'll obviously create a new one as we go along. You then have a section, you have four sections, rather: data model, service implementation, runtime artifacts, and service maintenance. Underneath the data model section, you have four sections, namely your entity types, which are things like you can think of them as your structure. So for example, here you would create a structure in the data dictionary, and then you would use it to determine what structure is used in your data model. So I mean, in the case of SFlight, I've just used literally the SFlight table type and brought it in, and obviously my data structure or entity looks like the same structure you would find in the SFlight table. The next section is associations. Here we'll get to this eventually in a section further on down the line, but you can create an association between something like your airline, your list of airlines, and you can connect them to your table of actual flights that are available, and you can sort of do a header item link, as it were. Then you've got your entity sets. So an entity set is effectively a table with a structure from your entity type. So when you create an entity type for SFlight, you'll have a SFlight set that's created as well. So when you do your calls, your OData calls, you would get back either a query for a set of data, or you would just get back a single line of data. So it's a single line versus a table effectively. An entity set is a set of data, so it's a table. And then obviously you've got your association set, so that's linked to associations, which we'll get to in a little bit. So that's your data model section. You then have your service implementation, and under here you've got your various different methods. So when you make your HTTP method calls, you have a get, set, update, delete, etc., etc. So this is obviously containing the different methods that the SAP Gateway has. So you have create, where you would create an item, delete an item, get an entity, where you would just pull a single line, so a single structure, get entity set. So this you would go select all from a table and give back a table set of data, and then obviously update. So you can pass a string of data back to SAP, a subset of data rather, back to SAP, and have it update the details based on what you've given back to the SAP Gateway. So yeah, you've got your service implementation here. Then you have your runtime artifacts, and the runtime artifacts are effectively just gateway classes that are, or gateway objects rather, created in the background when you obviously create your data model and add your bits and pieces and create your entity sets, etc. And so here, you don't, if you're doing this for the first time, you don't necessarily have to worry about all the different bits and pieces. We're going to focus on this data provider class itself. So now if you had to just double click on any one of these, so you've got a registered model, a registered service, a data provider base class, a data provider extension class, model provider base class, a model provider extension class. So you can obviously interact with these in different ways. And it's obviously got your object type here and your different object names across there. The main thing we're going to focus on for this tutorial of this course is the data provider class. So within the data provider class, SAP creates a base class, and then it creates this extension class. We're going to take, eventually, we're going to take this extension class and we're going to redefine the different methods that represent the different HTTP methods that are created here. So if I had to, for example, double click on this extension class, it's going to take us to SE80, and you can see it's got the superclass being the data provider base class, and it's got a whole bunch of inherited attributes. But now the most important thing, and where you're actually going to implement your logic based on those different methods, is you've got all these different methods here. And so you've got create entity, delete entity, get entity set, etc., etc. What's going to happen is you're going to redefine them. So in this example, I've already redefined them. So if I go to, let's say, airlines get entity set, you can see obviously we've got our superclass call here, but to get a table set of data, all I've done is in this redefined method inside this data provider class extension, which is based on the data provider main class that's obviously automatically created, when I would do the HTTP call for a get entity set method, I would return data based on this logic here. So select all from scar into ET entity set. Now I've put ET entity set there because it's the exporting table that is of the structure that we created previously as an entity set. So if we go, so obviously select all into this table here. Now if we go back, that ET entity set, which is the exporting entity set table that would eventually be given back to the front end, has the structure that we've created in our data model from our entity types. So our entity types have an entity set, which is the same structure type, which is then obviously automatically populated through to, for example, this data provider class, this extension data provider class, where when we implement our logic, in order to give it back to the front end, we have to pass it back to one of those variables. So those that ET exporting table entity set, And because it's obviously of that structure from SCAR, we can just select all from SCAR into that table and it'll give it back to our front end. So, I mean, obviously we'll go through this in detail, but that's briefly how the sort of structure works for these different artifacts. So the main thing you need to think about is I'm going to be using this data provider class, i.e. a class that provides data back to the front end after receiving a call. And I'm going to do it through some methods that have been redefined based on this data provider main class and obviously the extension. So that's just something to bear in mind in terms of the overall structure of your backend. That's how you're going to get data out to the front end effectively. And then obviously moving on from that, we just have the service maintenance section where if you were to double click on it, would take you to the Gateway Hub. And if you look here, obviously we will register our service as we go along in the, let's see if I click it here. So the service is already registered, but we would effectively go and register the service in Gateway. Whether you do this or someone from Basis does this is obviously depends on what system you have and how it's laid out. But if you're working on your own system or you have access, you can go and register your service, which we'll do further on. But then the main thing is when we do our testing of our service, there are two places we can do that. You can use SAP's Gateway client, which I'll click on here. And in the client, it'll have the request URI. So if we had to execute it, for example, we would receive a response. So I'm going to go through this response in far more detail as we go along. But you can see we've got S-flight set, airline set, etc., etc. So you're going to be picking all this stuff up in an XML response from Gateway, from the SAP Gateway. Now, the important thing is you don't have to use the SAP Gateway client. You can actually use the another piece of software. For example, you can use something like Postman, which you'll find a lot of UI5 guys use. I think there are a few other tools that you can use. I think you can do it directly in Visual Studio Code as well if you want, but I like Postman personally, so this is what I would use to do my testing, and this will obviously come up further down. But you can see I've run a GET request to obviously having my own local server following the same URL that we've got from the SAP Gateway client, which is exactly the same here. So if we had to, let's say, add a URI option that said, so if we had to call one of our entity sets like airline get entity set and execute, we would then receive back carrot ID, manned, everything, etc. And then obviously that would run as it is. So you could take this, go back to Postman and paste it on top, and you could send and obviously get the same data back. You can obviously look at it in different bits and pieces, and if I remember correctly, I think it's question dollar, or was it dollar question format equals JSON. Maybe I've got it the wrong way around. There we go. So you can then obviously change the format that you receive it in. So I've told it to query the format in JSON. So I want the formatting of the response that I get back from SAP in the format JSON, in JSON format, which is what we'll obviously be using in our UI5 app that we'll eventually put on top of this. And then obviously you've got your results with some metadata and then your list of airlines effectively. So I find this much more useful and more user-friendly. You don't have to. You can obviously use, especially if this is your sort of first time running with the Gateway client, you can obviously use to keep everything within SAP. That's absolutely fine. I'm just making sure you guys have the various options. So if we go back, so obviously that was the Gateway Hub. So now that we have sort of a brief overview, let's go ahead and actually create our own project from scratch and run through all of the steps in detail. Right, so now that we're back in the Gateway Service Builder, we are going to go ahead and start afresh, and we are going to create our own project in Gateway. And the first thing we're going to do is define a data model. So to create a new project, you obviously come into your Gateway Service Builder, and you can click on this little button here, which is Create Project, and we'll call this Z underscore flight model, and we'll just say flight model data tutorial. You can obviously name these whatever you want. We're going to leave everything else as is. Project type, generation strategy, we won't worry about that now. And obviously wherever you store this is up to you. I'm storing it as a local object, so it's in my temporary folder here. And so you have your project created. So now what we're going to do is we are going to create a data model, and we're going to do that based on a model from our flight table, but we're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to create the flight table. First of all, we're going to create the airline table itself, or the airline model. So we're going to have a set of airlines, and then we're going to create another model which is going to be from table S flight, based on that structure, and that's going to be the set of flights that you're going to get. And eventually we're going to connect the two so that you can see from your table of airlines what flights they have available. So we're going to go under data model, and to make this easier, we're going to right click, and we're going to, instead of creating one from scratch, which you can do, for the sake of this course and tutorial, we're going to import the structure directly from our data dictionary. So all we're going to do there is we're going to call, let's just say SCAR, and it's obviously the entity type is going to stay as is, and what we're going to do is we're going to pull it directly from the SCAR structure here. And obviously create the default entity set, because we want the entity set to be based on the same structure as the SCAR table, which is obviously just a table of different airlines based on the airline model. So we're going to go ahead and click next, and then we are going to decide what fields we want to bring in. So we're going to select everything. Don't worry about anything else, importing search helps and stuff. We're just doing this to purely get data out of SAP to the front end. So we're going to click next, and then it's going to ask you to set a key. So in this case, we are just going to set the client and the caret ID as the key, just a simple key. And so that's going to create our model based on what we need. And if we open this up, we're going to have our entity type and our different properties that we pulled in. And if we look under entity set, it's going to have an entity set created. And if we, now that we have that, we're going to go, before we create the second part of this model, we're going to go ahead and create we're going to go ahead and click the generate runtime objects. What that's going to do is it's going to basically build and create everything else we need inside our gateway model, so that we can start sending data back. So it's going to do all the other stuff under the hood that you would have seen in the previous section. So we're going to go ahead and click that, and it's going to ask you for your different names for your model class, your data provider class, and your service registration details. Again, because we're not going into too much detail, we're going to leave this as is and obviously focus on this class here, and we're going to let SAP name it for us. And again, it's a local object, so I'm going to keep it in my developer under my developer profile, but obviously in normal projects this would be put somewhere in a particular package for transport, etc. So if we click on save, And you can see it's come back and it's created all the different bits and pieces for us. And if we look under our runtime artifacts, you can see everything is there that we need for this particular section. Now, what we're going to do is, before we go and have a look at everything else that we've pulled, we're going to create the second part of our model. And so let's just minimize everything so you can see what I'm doing. And so now that we have the part of the model where we get our airlines, we want to get the, which is from table S car, we want to get the data from table S flight, which is going to have the all the flights that are available for the different airlines. And so again, to make life easier, because the structure already exists, we're going to pull it directly from our dictionary, and we're going to call this S flight. So obviously it makes sense to you guys, and you can see the link. You can obviously call this whatever you want based on your company's naming conventions, and the entity type is there. And so we're going to pull this from S flight, and it's going to be pulled directly from SAP. This could be Z underscore S flight structure if it's a custom structure that you've made. And again, we want to create the default entity set so we can pull so we can have our table data ready to push back to from Gateway to the front end. And again, it's asking us which fields we want. We want to pull all of the fields, and we're not going to worry about search helps and all of that. We're going to click next, and we're going to determine our key for this. So again, we're going to just do client and airline, and we're going to do flight number as well, just because that helps us create a slightly more detailed key, because we've obviously got a few more bits and pieces to work with here. So this is the key we're going to use. And obviously we can come back and change this at a later stage if we run into any issues. But for the most part, we're going to leave it as is. For now, we're going to click on finish. And again, once we've done that, you can see nothing, our runtime artifacts haven't changed or anything like that. So what we want to do is now we need to add all of the parts of the runtime artifacts that we've got for the second part of this model, i.e. from S-Flight. So we're going to click generate objects again, or we're going to generate the runtime objects again, and we'll see if it picks up any errors, hopefully not. And there we go. So all of these were updated successfully. So if we go back to our runtime artifacts, nothing's changed. But if we double click on this and go into SE80, you can see the different methods. So we've got our scar methods, so create, delete, get entity set. But now we also have in those same runtime artifacts, so within the same data provider class, we've got sflight, create, delete, get entity set as well. So you can see where those parts of the model, even though they're two different things, they both sit under the data provider class. And you'll see the difference when we make the calls, how we call those different parts of the model effectively. So you can see where that is. So let's just go back and check everything's okay. So now under entity types, we have scar with its various properties. We have sflight with its various properties. And then we have two entity sets for each one, scar set, sflight set. And then obviously under our service implementation, we've got our different methods that'll be available to us when we do get, put, update, delete, etc. in those HTTP methods. And obviously the same for the sflight set as well. And then obviously our runtime artifacts are here. All of our messages are okay. Don't worry about these warnings yet. We'll get to those in a little bit. All you need to know is that your different classes, your model class, etc. were generated successfully, and there are no red errors that we need to worry about. Right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to try and use the model we've created to pull some data out of SAP. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that everything's done, but no, now we have to implement our actual ABAP logic that says when this happens, give this data back to Gateway and eventually to the front end. So you can do this through Gateway Hub. I'm going to do these first few items through Gateway Hub. So I've just gone under service maintenance, and I want to show you guys the error you get if you haven't properly implemented the methods that would eventually give the data back to you if you made a call from outside of SAP. So I've gone and clicked on Gateway Hub under service maintenance, and we're going to need to register a service soon, but I'm just going to take you straight to the Gateway client. Oh, well, there you go. So I can't even get to the Gateway client because my service is not registered in the system. So now we're going to go ahead and register the service. And to do that, we are going to click on Register. And that's going to take us to the Add Service section. We don't need to change much here. Everything's sort of auto-generated. So you've got your technical service name, which you will show you in the service list that you get. It's just got your description, etc., etc. So we're going to leave this as is. Let SAP generate it and carry on. Oh, I need to specify a package, so I'm just going to create click local object. That should work. Right, so now my service should be registered, and to check that, I can go to a transaction called IWFND /maint underscore service, and in here you'll see your service catalog effectively, so all the different services that you have available. So let me just go ahead and sort this now. Let's see if I can find it. And here you go. So you can see the one we went through in the introductory section is over here, and now I've just registered the Z flight model service, so it puts SRV on the end, and it's our flight model OData tutorial service. So it's registered, and the status is active and everything's running fine, so don't worry about this too much. Obviously, if you run into any issues, this is where you would come back to first to see if your service is actually running. You would also come back to reload metadata if you've made any changes to the service in the gateway client, in the gateway transaction itself. So yeah, this is what that is. And obviously this transaction code I'll link in the video description. But for the most part, this is fine, so we can leave that. Now, we want to actually get some data from SAP. So if we go to the client, we are going to execute the GET request, except we're going to get an error message back from SAP saying that, oh, sorry, so this is just the initial XML data. So what you'll find here is your different entity sets that you've created will be listed here with various details and annotations. So you'll see like it's updatable as false, deletable as false. Same for the S-Flight set. You'll have your different links to effectively wherever you need to go. So we can also change this. I think we can change this to JSON. Well, probably not actually. Okay, there we go. So it's basically telling you which entity sets you have available. So if we wanted to do something like a basic query to say, give us back our entity set, we can click on, we obviously add it manually, but you can also click on the entity sets here. And if you click on scars set, SAP will change this for you if you're not comfortable with your different URL calls, etc. And we've left the format JSON on the end because we want to get the format back in JSON because that's what we're going to be reading in our UI5 app. So let's see what happens if we ask for the scar set. Now remember, the scar set is the table of data. So if we ask SAP to give us back more than one line of data, this is what we're going to call. So, and if you call, obviously, I just want one line, you need to add a parameter here in brackets saying I want a single line, for example. But let's see what happens if we just say, give us back a set of data. Now, you'll notice you have a status code of 501, and the reason that you get back from SAP is it's not been implemented. So we haven't actually gone and redefined those methods we spoke about earlier and added any logic, for example, select all from SCAR into our ET entity set table. So we need to go ahead and do that. And so you will get this error message quite often if you've forgotten to, or if you just simply haven't implemented the correct method, or if you're calling the incorrect method. This is what you'll get back. So obviously this is just some error bits and pieces, error message bits and pieces here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and implement the get entity set method. Now in a lot of tutorials they'll do the get entity method first. I'm going to do the get entity set method first so that you can get the data back, and then I'll explain to you how to get a single line from SAP. So let's go back, and you can do this in a separate window, or you can go straight from your gateway transaction into your data provider class. And if we double click here, we've got data that's been modified, which is fine. So if this comes up, you can just click save and come back and regenerate your bits and pieces later. So now that we're here in SE80, we've got our class that we're dealing with. We find our methods, and you'll see we don't have any redefined methods. We've just got the methods we've inherited from the superclass. And again, they're all here. So now all we're looking for is get entity set for our SCAR set. And obviously, if you want to get a single line, it's get entity. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to redefine the method. So I select the method I want, right click on it, click on redefine, and it's going to redefine that method down here. And obviously in SE80 I can now go ahead and edit it. So don't worry about the call to the superclass. All we're going to do is we are going to take not pattern, signature. What we're looking for is the exporting table entity set. And so you can see it's of the table type SCAR because that's the table type we've set. This exporting table for the entity set is the where we need to put the data we've pulled from SAP into so that it can be given back to the front end. So if we hide our signature, all we're going to do is we're going to run select all, select all from table SCAR into table ET entity set. And we're going to go ahead and save that, check everything's okay, and we're going to activate. Now that that's activated and this call is here within this redefined method, let's go back and see if we get any data in return. And so to do that, I'm going to go back again, and I'm now back here. Under service maintenance, I'm going to go to the Gateway Hub. And under there, I'm going to go back to the Gateway client. And I've got my details here. I want to change my format back to JSON. I want to pull an entity set, and I want the SCAR set. So now this SCAR set, so this URL with this SCAR set should hit the SAP Gateway, and SAP Gateway should know to call that redefined method that we've just implemented our ABAP logic in, run that logic, pass the data back, and we should get some data here in our HTTP response. So let's execute. And so now you can see we've got our list of carriers back. Here's American Airlines, Air Berlin, Air Canada, etc., etc. And obviously a status code of 200, which is a OK return or successful return. Now, what I want to show you is if you have an issue with your backend and something's not coming through, I'm going to show you how to effectively debug the backend. And it's just like you would with any ABAP program. We're going to set a external breakpoint. So let's jump back into our class. And we can look for our redefined methods here. And all we do is pop in our external breakpoint. And if we go back and re-execute this HTTP call to SAP, we should hit that breakpoint. So let's have a look. There you go. So now you can see we've hit the breakpoint on our logic, and we just want to see what's being put in the return table because there could be an issue there. So we just do a single step over, double click on ET entity set, and then let's have a look at the data. And the data all looks good. Everything's there, so we can go back and we can continue through, and we get our list back here. So that's effectively how you can start debugging things if you find any issues or your data is not coming back properly. And that's how you would grab a entity set or table of data. Now what I want to show you is how to call a single line of data using the getEntity method, and obviously how we change and add parameters into our HTTP URL call as well. So let's jump into that. Right, so now what I'm going to show you is how to find the URL that you would need to call or send back to the SAP Gateway to get a single line of data. In other words, trigger the getEntity method. And it's pretty straightforward. Obviously when you call your entity set, you get a bunch of metadata here. Obviously this is in JSON format, but you would see it in your XML as well. For this particular entity, which is one of many entities in an entity set, you have a URL here, which is very similar to this one at the top, except you have these brackets with your client and your carried ID. Now, if you remember back when we put this entity, when we put this model together, we created a key for the SCA entity itself, and we put the client and carried ID as the key. And so when you want to get an entity, you have to pass in those key values to get back the data you want. And we're going to implement that now. But if we had to take this and put it up here, and if we had to execute now, what we should receive is a 501 because it's not implemented. So now let's go ahead and implement that and see if we can pull out a single entity. So to do that, we come back to SE80 and we find our inherited methods, and we look for SCA set getEntity, right click, redefine, and it's now redefined it for us. We're not going to worry about any of that boilerplate code. We are just going to go ahead and select single all. We're just going to pull basically everything back and put it directly into our structure. Again, we're not worried about proper ABAP code and all of that. We can tidy that up as we go along. This is just to show you how to do it from a high level. Select single all from SCA into. Now if we look at our signature, we are looking for our entity, which is here, and it's obviously on our SCA type, but it's called ER entity. So let's just close that. So into ER underscore entity, where MAN DT equals. Now you're wondering, well, where do I get the values that are now passed in? And so that requires another slightly important step, but something that you may not be used to, because now we're going to start calling almost like key value pairs here. And so if we take a look at the signature again, you're going to have something called an importing table key tab over here. And this is where you're going to get your values that were passed in based on the different keys effectively. So in this table, you're going to have two rows that you need to pull from that have your manned or client, and obviously a column with a value, and then obviously our carried, which is also going to have a value in that second column. So to do that, we are going to use our ABAP shorthand, and we're going to call, we're going to create a local variable called manned, and I'll leave a link down below for the ABAP syntax I'm using here, because it is slightly shorthand, but it's just searching for, it's just basically running a read table almost in a single line. So we've got our declared variable here, and we want to search through the IT key tab, and in there we want to look for the column name, and in that column we want to search for value carried. Okay, and now that we have that, we want to pull from that same line the value column, like that. So we've got a local variable here that we've declared. We want to read through our table, looking for the column called name that has the line that has the value carried ID in it. Once we've found that line, we want to pull the value column or the value field and put it in here. And so we're going to do exactly the same thing for carried ID as well. And so we pull from our IT key tab, looking for the name column. Oh, sorry, this, I'm getting confused here. This should be MANDT, my apologies. And this is going to be carried. And again, pulling the value. So now we should have two values pulled from two lines within this key tab or key table. And all we're going to say, where manned equals LV manned, which is the value we've declared, and carried equals LV underscore carried. Just format that. And we're going to check the field man can be specified in the where condition. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. We are just going to, so the client is going to be handled as is. Even though the client's part of the key, we're going to pass it in. We don't actually worry about using it in this particular select statement. We're just going to use carried ID, which is fine. And we will just delete that, Shift F1 and Control F2 to run the same check. All right, the check is cleared. So again, when we hit this, we have our, and again, I'll set a breakpoint now, but let's just see if it works. So we have our carried ID pulling in from the value in our IT key tab and running a simple select statement into our entity here, which is our single line, which then should be given back to us. So let's go see if it works. And don't forget to activate. All right, so now we're going to go back to our gateway client, running the same thing here. Also note that we need to pass this in no matter what, because we will receive a key error. So if we had to leave that out, just get rid of the comma and execute, it's a 404 not found. And obviously we can check the error log here, but we'll do that in a minute. I just want to see that it actually works. So if we run mandt equals 1, comma. Now if we execute this, we get a 200 back, and we get obviously our client, American Airlines, and you can see there's nothing else. So now I'm going to put this here. You can also, if you can't remember the different URI options, you can find them by clicking on this add URI options, and we're just going to pull the format JSON. So there you go, question mark $ format equals JSON. Executing it again, you can see it a bit better. So now by calling this URL here, we just get a single line and nothing else. So it's as straightforward as that. Obviously, if you wanted to debug that, we would go back, set our breakpoint, set an external breakpoint, and if we execute again, we should hit the debugger. And you can see we've got our data here. So if you look at this IT key tab, you can see why we have to pull each individual line. So there's your man to there, 001, carrier ID there. Obviously we just pulled the carrier ID. And if we single step through that, we can check our local variable. Just make this a bit taller. You can check our local variable was pulled successfully as one of the importing parameters, so that's fine. And then if we step over our select statement, we can see that our ER entity was pulled and filled in correctly. And if we execute all the way through, we get our single line. Now, what I want to show you before we move on is the possible error log. So if you're debugging and you can't find anything in the back end, and something's gone wrong and you don't know what's going on, and it's not specifically ABAP code, I've removed one of these parameters, and I want to see if I can find the error that tells me that I'm missing a parameter for it. So if I execute, you should get a response, and I'll just take away the JSON format because it might be a bit clearer with XML. So in the XML response, you'll see it says for backend administrators run transaction IWFND error log on your system. Now if we go there, this is where you're going to also find possible errors and how to fix them. So if we open up a new tab, and we just paste that in. I think you have to do /n as well. Now if we look here, you can see at this time, so for this particular item, the request URI contains an invalid key predicate. So that just means that you haven't specified your key properly. So you might have gone and built this fantastically large OData model in Gateway, and you've just forgotten which get entity methods require which keys, etc., etc. This is one of the places where it'll catch that error when you're passing it back and forth. So just remember that error transaction IWFND error log. Again, I'll leave this in the description as well, but you will spend a lot of time debugging, but you'll also spend a lot of time in here, you know, getting bugs that are not necessarily in your actual backend code. Right, so now we're going to move on to the section we spoke about earlier, associations. Now, associations are there primarily to create a link between two parts of your OData model. So, for example, we've got SCAR, which is a list of airlines, and you can sort of think of that as your header, like a PO header or sales order header or whatever it is. And then we have a list of flights, which you could consider the items, like PO items or sales order items or whatever it is. And what we want to do is we want to be able to call our data model and pass in a value so that we can actually navigate using our header down into our list of flights. as it were. So it'll make more sense as we go ahead. But we're now going to set up things like cardinality and relationships and foreign keys and all that sort of stuff. So let's jump right in. You're going to, underneath associations, you're going to right click and create. And in the window that pops up, we need to give this new association or this new relationship a name. So we'll call it SCAR to SFlight. You can obviously name this however you want using whatever naming convention you have in your project. Now we need to specify the principal entity, which is going to be our sort of header entity. This is going to be SCAR. And the cardinality for this is 1 because it's one of these is one of itself, and we're going to connect it now. And we are going to create a navigation property. And so with this, we are just going to call it head to item, or let's call it header to item. And now we're going to create, or we're going to connect it to the dependent entity, which is our list of flights. So this is going to be SFlight. And obviously the entities are from our data model behind us. That's where I'm getting these names from. The cardinality is going to be 1 is to many, because one of these is going to equal many flights or more than one flight. And obviously we don't need to create a navigation property here. So now we're going to go ahead and click next. And now what it's going to do is it's going to ask you to connect the key from SCAR, or the SCAR entity, which we've obviously created before, where we had our client manned and carried, the carrier ID. So all we're going to do is in the dependent table, when we connect this, is we're going to connect it to manned and carried ID. And we press enter. Sorry. Okay, so it is case sensitive. So I think, there we go. So it is case sensitive, and it's case sensitive when you open up your properties, because your property names may not necessarily be all caps like they are in the data dictionary or whatever it is. So we've connected our principal property, a principal key, which is determined by the SCAR entity itself, and we gave it a key of client and carrier ID, and our dependent property is connected to it via carried and manned as well. So let me click next. And this is just telling us this is our association set name, and these are the two entities that are going to be connected. So we can go ahead and click finish. And that'll obviously go ahead and generate everything we need. So we can see our association is here, SCAR to SFlight, and obviously any other properties underneath. It's got all of our values in here. It's dependent entity, cardinality, etc. 1 is to many. You can also see we've created an association set as well. So if we want to use that to get more than one result from from when we navigate. So if we run our navigation through, we might want to get one result or multiple results, depending, just like it works with our entity types and entity sets. So it works the same way. And so now, after we've completed that, we're going to go and have a look at our metadata that gets returned to us. But before we do that, we need to go ahead and regenerate. So we click on our regeneration or generation button, and our runtime objects should be generated. Brilliant. So that has been completed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our Gateway Hub, which I think I've already got open. Yep, so I've already got it open here. And what we're going to do is I want to show you the metadata that's returned so that you can see how this works and how sort of everything relates. So I'm just going to, we're just going to get, and then we are going to specify dollar metadata. So we're just grabbing the metadata back from our from Gateway itself. And so that's now run and returned us, given us a return back. So now you can see we've got our entity. So our entity type scar is here with our 2 keys. And then obviously all the different properties. Then we've got our sFlight over here with its key and all of its properties and all of its annotations. Then as we move down, you can see we've got an association here. And in that association, you can see it's called scar to sFlight. And you can see it runs, it's got different bits of metadata here, but it just shows you how your principal role runs using this key, the mant and carrier ID, and then obviously moving on to your dependent, your sFlight table here. So it's all working and linked up in your metadata that comes out of Gateway itself. And now, more importantly, you also note you've got your navigation property as well, which is over here, which is underneath our scar entity. So you can find that navigation property here, and we're now going to use that to test out our when we run our call, how we can use this navigation property to actually get the data that we need. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run our a call for our association and see what happens. So what effectively should happen is we should pass in a header value with I'll explain to you as I sort of type it out. But effectively, we are looking for the scar set. So we are now going to ask for an entity, or pass in an entity. So that's mandt equals 001. Yep. And we're going to pass it the carrier ID as well. And that's going to be American Airlines, and we're going to close it off. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to execute this like we would normally. 404 not found. What have I done wrong? Maybe I haven't typed it correctly. Sorry. So this was, again, case sensitive. It's a small s, so just be aware of that. So now when we execute, we get a return back with American Airlines, and we get obviously all the rest of the details with it. But then you'll notice that in the schema, you have a ref here called scar set header to item. Now this is the URL that you're going to use to call your header to item navigation. So if I take this header to item from the metadata and put it in, and we execute, we can see, sorry, it's a 404, so my URL was incorrect. If I execute again, you can see it's a 501, not implemented. And so what's happening here is it's calling that role to get that navigation to get your items based on what you've passed in from your header. But now it actually needs to get those items. And where are those items coming from? sFlight. And we now need to implement the sFlight get entity set method, which we haven't yet, because that's effectively where this navigation is pointing to in Gateway. So now let's go ahead and add our implementation to get a list of flights based on this carrier ID. Now back in our Gateway Service Builder, you can obviously navigate directly to the class if you want to. I'm just doing it from here so you can see what I do. So if I have a look for my runtime artifacts, double click on my data provider class, double click again, it's going to take us to SE80, where we can just make this a little bit bigger. And now underneath our data provider class extension, we find our methods, and here's our two redefined methods that we've been working with already for scar. And now we look for our inherited method, sFlight in this case, So you can also see scar, the inherited methods disappear and come down to under the redefinition section once they have been redefined. So we want sFlight set, get entity set, because we want to get a list of items based on our header navigation. So we right click on redefine. Here's our redefine method. And now, just like we did before, just like we've done in the get, yeah, we'll save that. Just like we've done in get entity, we need to do exactly the same thing by pulling our keys from our key table. Now obviously this might not make sense at this point because we're now getting the entity in scar's example, where we're just getting one line, we're passing it in. But then in get entity set for scar as well, we didn't do that. Well, now, because of the fact that we're using navigation from header to item, and we're passing in two values as part of the key to determine what we get back, because we want American Airlines and only the flights for American Airlines, we're now going to call get entity set, but with some importing parameters as well. So if we go back to get entity set, I'm just going to, okay, I'll have to type it then, that's fine. So we're going to create a local variable for caret ID. Remember in the last step, we didn't have to worry about client, even though it's part of the key, so it will be available here, but we don't need it for our select statement. So we now have a local variable caret ID, and we need to read through the internal table key tab, and we need to pass in the name column, which is caret. So now this is now reading the line where the name is caret ID, and we want the value, which is the value of the key, passed back into caret. So what have I done wrong here? Oh, whoops. So we've got our local variable for carrier ID pulled from our key table, and now we're just going to do a select, except in this case we're going to do select all from sFlight, because we're now pulling data from sFlight directly into table. Remember the exporting table entity set, which is now formatted based on our data model, or our OData model. It's now formatted exactly as the sFlight table is, and because we've done that formatting the same in our model, we can just call it directly from sFlight into our ET entity set exporting table. And where caret equals LV carrier ID. So we can go ahead and save that, and we can just shift F1, control F2 to check, and we can control F3 to activate. And now let's go ahead and test. So now, whereas before we would get a 501 not implemented, if we execute again, calling our scar set. So remember, we're not calling our sFlight set at all. We're calling scar set with our two keys, and we're calling the navigation, the association or navigation property. What we should get back is a list of flights based on American Airlines. And that's a good sign. So status 200 and sFlight set, and there you go. So here is all the detail from sFlight, and obviously you can see it's American Airlines. Again, American Airlines, and if we scroll all the way to the bottom, American Airlines. So that's how we can now use our header to item navigation and build an association between our two entities, so that when we make this call in our UI5 application, we can get the data we need with one line of code effectively. Now that we've finished with associations, before we continue, there's one more step we need to add, because when we go back to our implementation, we've missed a step when we pull our list of flights, which we need to adjust. So what's happening here is we're just expecting only a association call to hit this method that gets us a list of flights. But you might have a necessity in your application where you just want to get a list of all the flights available for whatever reason on a an initial screen before you add filtering, etc., etc. So what we need to do is we need to adjust this a little bit, and so for those of you who really know your ABAP, you'll notice that the way I've written this is not great, because what happens if this key tab is empty? And that is a very real possibility, because you might call this without a key, i.e. when you just want to get a full list of flights. You might just call in your URL sFlight set with no parameters at all. And so what will happen is this will fail. And we don't want to just allow this to fail and catch an exception, which obviously we should do and work with, although that is beyond the scope of this particular course. We want to make sure that this variable is only filled, and this read table only happens if there is actually a value or if there is something in the key tab to work with. And so to handle that, what we're going to do is we're just going to pop in a simple if statement. Now, I'm just doing this if statement in a way that helps you understand what happens when we do different steps. There are obviously better ways to do this, and you can implement this however you want. But for our sake and for demo purposes, I'm going to make it as clear as possible. So if IT key tab is not initial, run this, get our value, run our select statement, else simply run our select statement without any variables, end if, so shift F1 to format. So if I just tidy this up, so you can see if the key tab is not initial, if there are values in there, get the value, run the select statement based on that value, else run our select statement for everything, put it in ET entity set, and carry on. So now if we control F2 to check, control F3 to activate, we're going to now put a breakpoint in and run our OData call, and let's see how it runs through this if statement specifically for the sFlight set get entity set. So now that we're back in our gateway client, we're going to remove this scar set header to item navigation call. We're going to grab our other entity set sFlight set, and we're just simply going to execute a call, and we should expect a full list of flights back from the sFlight table. So now we've hit our breakpoint. If we double click on IT key tab, there's nothing in there. Let's skip, run one step. It's now skipped over everything, and it's going to run our full select for everything. One more step over that. And if we check our ET entity set, we can see all of our different flights from American Airlines, Japan Airlines, the whole lot. So we can then just continue through our code, and we get a response back of 200, except now we've got all of these different flights from airlines other than American Airlines. So we've not only set up the entity relationship between header and item, we've also allowed it so that we can call just the items or just the list of flights and get values back from that. So we have both options, which is obviously what we need. So you can also obviously implement this if you want to get just an entity for a flight itself, but we're going to use the header to item navigation primarily to keep things simple, and also call a list of flights possibly as well. And that is it. So if you've made it this far, well done. You should have a working OData model that you can query to pull data from the SCAR and also the SFlight table. And you should be able to now test it in the SAP Gateway client. You can obviously also copy your URLs into Postman as well if you want to test it that way, which is how I prefer to do it. But you can use both. If you guys have any questions, please let me know down in the comments and I will try and help where I can. And as always, if you guys like the video, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, thanks for watching.